Issa Pasha and I had quite the acquaintance with the act of moving from one place to another within a short interval of time. The Pasha had a distinct passion for travelling, a feature that made him quite likeable and interesting as a fellow person. We spent a night in Weaverham, strolling along the cobblestone roads. The villagers were amused by such an alluring man as the Pasha. His thin, trimmed beard connected to form a smooth point at the end of his chin, his clean, scarlet fez that was placed upon his neat bundle of black hair, his tall height, and his slender arms, the right of which held onto a hard walking stick. The iron ferrule began to wear, as he had used it quite frequently. A group of children stared at him as we passed. They were not stares of maliciousness, rather they were of pure, innocent curiosity. He looked back, smiled, then raised his hand. "Say, Captain," said he, "I wonder what games these children play. I haven't had the slightest clue, for I couldn't care less. Throw ball," I said finally, yet rhetorically. It was quite simple, that deduction. Any child would enjoy passing around a ball amongst a circle of their fellow kind. The Pasha pointed his stick at one of the children. He was a chubby child, wearing round glasses, and was absorbed in the pages of a small book. "Ah, Yvette," the Pasha said. "You see, Sykes, this child is a student of chess, a fantastic game. It is good that parents teach them at such a young age." I smiled awkwardly, looking at this peculiar child. "Just because he wears glasses and is reading a book, you can deduce that he can play chess?" I asked him. Issa Pasha shook his head. "No, my dear friend Sykes, that is not the case. You see, his pockets are bulging. Along the bottom of the bulge are smooth edges. That, I deduce, are the heads of pawns. Black pawns, by Jove, Pasha." "How in thunder could you guess those pawns to be black?" I said in amusement. "Ah, now see, the upper part of his deep pocket. The edge of the bulge are irregular. Hence, he carries the other characters of this game, the bishop, the rook, the horses, and the queen." And at last, he pointed again. I looked closely, examining a small cross poking out of the boy's pocket. A black cross. He had collected the pieces off the board, starting from the pawns to the rooks, until at last, the king. "I'd reckon he has the White Army in his other pocket. Allow me, Sykes." Issa Pasha crossed the street as a horse-drawn carriage passed by. He approached the children, who greeted him, although I must say it was quite apprehensive from their side. He spoke to them with a kind, friendly voice, appearing to cause them to talk with ease. I watched as he shook his gloved hand with the boy wearing the round glasses. They exchanged a few words, then the boy turned, showing the Pasha the other white pieces from his pocket. The Pasha rubbed his head, laughing. He pet the boy on the shoulder, then returned to the rest of the children. One of them had brought him a jump rope. It was a long jump rope held by a little girl. This made the Pasha laugh again. He took off his fez, placing it on the head of the chubby child as he gazed with curiosity. He took it off, placing the charcoal black tassel between his fingers. I quickly ran up to Isa. "Pasha," I called, "aren't you a little too tall to jump rope?" The kids around him giggled. "Nonsense, Sykes," he said back. "Yvette, I may be tall, but I assure you I can jump just fine." "Watch me, Sykes." The children stood back, watching the Pasha with eager eyes. He took a deep breath, then jumped while swinging the rope forward. In record time, the tall man was jumping rope. It was, I admit, an incredible sight to see. Some passers-by stopped on the sidewalk, admiring my friend's skills. He went faster, causing the rope to lash through the air like a deadly whip. He then began to display a show, hopping on one foot. The children cheered, some clapping their hands while others hooted. He swung the ropes by his sides, then stopped, panting with fatigue. It must have been quite some time, as a crowd had amassed behind my back. They all had smiles, showing their teeth with appreciation. "The one and only Isa Pasha," I announced, making the crowd give my friend a round of applause. The Pasha gave a subtle, courteous bow, then retrieved his fez. "Bravo! Bravo!" A voice from the dispersing crowd came forward. A neat man with a hat shook hands with the Pasha. He had shrewd, brown eyes, and had recently shaved his moustache, yet improperly as a cut mark was visible above his lip. "The name's Basil. Inspector Basil, Yvette. Now let us see. You are a dignified man with a keen interest in reading fiction, I'd wager, judging by the paper cuts on your fingers. You read fast, causing you to turn over the volumes of pages of fiction manuscripts quickly. You were once a policeman working in Scotland Yard, yet you decided to withdraw from London and come to this humble village for a quieter life. You're married, with an only child, a boy of around 8. You also enjoy a good game of chess, I would have to guess. Basil was taken aback, his eyebrows raised, and his hands clenched. Your reputation suits you, Mr. Pasha. The Pasha smiled. Yvette, now you are going to ask me the reasons behind my deductions. Well, your gloves hanging by your side. They are the same as used by the yard. And your socks. He pointed down at his socks with his walking stick. They are checkered, black and white, just like the pattern of a chessboard along with your round hat. That was a guess. And your son has accumulated all the pieces of a fine chessboard in his 2 pockets. The Pasha pointed to the chubby boy standing by him. How on earth did you know he was my son? Basil said. Simple. You have been looking at him this whole time. Not only that, but you have been looking at him since the beginning of our conversation. Now, go along, Simon. How did you know his name was Simon? Calm down, Inspector Basil, Issa said, irritated. I talked to him. He told me his name. I'm not a psychic. I'm a human being, just like you, so calm down, Luffin. Basil nodded, then turned to me. I introduced myself, then gave him a cordial handshake. Well, Pasha, Basil continued, your reputation lives to the truth. We need your help. Issa Pasha lifted his left eyebrow, looking curiously at the inspector. Yvette, that is why people come to Isa Pasha. Yalla, let us begin. Captain Sykes shall accompany me. Basil nodded. Please, follow me to the police station. It was a chilly evening when we arrived at the station. The sky had turned red, and the sun had begun to fall underneath the horizon. We then entered a room facing the main entrance. It was the inspector's office. We sat down, facing Inspector Basil as he slumped tumultuously into his seat. Isa Pasha looked at him, tapping the fingers against the handle of his walking stick. Basil sighed deeply. It is murder. There has been a murder, the Pasha said immediately. Good heavens, Pasha, I didn't even say anything. You didn't have to, Isa replied. I know the depressing, despondent sigh from any policing official. Murder. Someone was killed, their life taken in cold blood. Basil nodded in agreement. This is a strange case, Pasha. You see, the murderer has already been caught. An eerie silence filled the room. I looked at my friend who had placed both his index fingers delicately against his lips, lost in thought. This behavior was normal of him whenever he needed to brainstorm all the cards, all the possibilities involved in his bone-chilling cases. He abruptly began to blink rapidly at Inspector Basil as those words came out of his mouth. Pardon, Basil Effendi. That's right, we got that dirty rascal. He's locked up here as we speak, awaiting trial and most likely execution. Likely, I ask, confused. You see, our killer's name is Bruce. Nigel Bruce. Our victim is a Terry Kilburn. Petty Nigel is an escaped convict from Liverpool for murder and theft. He was caught passing here by my officers. Not only that, but we managed to squeeze that rat into telling us of a murder done. I'm sure you know of it. Ah, yes, I said excitedly. The disappearance of Terry Kilburn near Cheshire. I read it in the papers. Correct, Basil replied. We have come to believe that Nigel murdered Terry in cold blood on his run from Liverpool. But we have yet one central evidence to show before the jury. The body of Mr. Terry Kilburn. The Pasha finished his sentence presto. That's where we need you, Isa Pasha. Are you up for the task? Isa Pasha sighed, taking off his fez and placing it on his lap. Yvette, he finally said, why not? We have come this far. A small Pasha mystery wouldn't hurt to do. May I speak to this Nigel, whom you have imprisoned here? Basil nodded. Follow me, Pasha. They took us to the lower level of the station where the prison cells resided. A warden greeted us, spinning his keys around his finger. Well, Basil, he said. Who do we have here? This is Isa Pasha, Basil said. He is a detective who has agreed to help us on the case of the disappearance of Terry Kilburn. Will you kindly lead us to Nigel's cell, warden? The warden agreed, then signalled us to follow him. He walked down the passageway. It was quiet, unusual when one is brought up with the thought of policing captivity. There was only one inmate, and it was Nigel. He shot up as the warden unlocked his cell, looking at us malevolently. He was a languid man with evil eyes and a twisted lip. His face looked like it was covered in black chimney soot, and his hair was short and dirty. He moved back against the wall as Isa Pasha entered. The Pasha looked around attentively, then requested the inspector and the warden to leave us while we spoke to the convict. Greetings, Nigel. I am Isa Pasha. He extended his hand, but Nigel didn't take it. He continued to stare at Isa, especially at his red fez. Isa withdrew his hand, then sat on the bed, crossing one leg over the other. Nigel then turned his attention to me. I introduced myself quite promptly, if I may say so, before he returned the greeting with an apprehensive wave. Isa Pasha rolled his eyes in annoyance. He was already beginning to adapt to the constant prejudice towards him here in England. "Well, Mr. Nigel," Isa continued, "you are aware of the charges that have so handsomely incriminated you." He nodded in silence, "And you have no defense whatsoever." He shook his head. "I know what I did," he spoke with a rasp. "There is no denying it. I can see the conciting that you are wearing Kilburn's clothing as we spacing, conciting a Siegungstisting." It was a long sleeve, complemented by the chestnut brown coat the man had dressed himself with. The lower buttons, they are in tension, Yvette. It is not the right fit. To comply, the shirt and the dirtiness of your face do not match. Not at all. No. And your boots, he pointed at them. They are not as unclean when it comes to travel. A traveller, especially one on foot, couldn't possibly wear shoes that shined when put in light. They must accumulate some form of untidiness. Hence you are wearing his shoes as well. Not only that, but you must have come here from somewhere near, say Cuddington, along Warrington Road. Nigel's eyes widened in surprise at his statement. "Ah, Yvette, your expression proves my sayings to be loyal. Now, Mr. Kilburn was in Cuddington, or most likely near Cuddington, where he ran into you somehow. Either you lured him someplace, or you killed him there and hid the body, robbing him of his attire. Either you buried him or disposed of the body through another means." As usual, when in deep concentration, he placed both his index fingers against his lips, staring at the shaking convict who hadn't even spoken much. However, to the Pasha, his expression spoke volumes against him. His fingers began to twitch in rhythm with his twisted lip. "You couldn't have burned him," Isa continued, "as anyone who passed or lived near would have noticed the flame. Burying would be more convenient, although the police hounds should have found it by then." His eyebrows furrowed, then he lifted his fingers. "Perhaps," said he, "you had disposed of the body in a liquid. Something that will conveniently go unnoticed, although the decaying corpse will display signs under the water." Nigel began shaking fervently now. He slumped down onto the floor, not taking his gaze off the Pasha. "What do you want?" he exploded. Isa tapped his walking stick on the convict's shoes. "Your shoes, Mr. Nigel!" "I want your shoes." Still shaking, Nigel took off his shoes, throwing them in front of the Pasha, who tipped his fares before picking them up. "Shukran," he said politely. "Come Sykes," I followed him, taking a final glare at Nigel. He was shivering, his back against the wall. He spat at me, before retreating to his bed by crawling like a disabled panther. Not too long after, Isa Pasha and I were in a cab heading down Warrington Road towards Cuddington. Nightfall had occurred, and the road was dark. Soon, we left the sight of buildings and lights and were under the impression of the constellations that twinkled so magnificently in the sky. Isa had his eyes fixed on the road as the lantern lit our way. "Here, Sykes," he abruptly spoke, "hold the reins." I did as told, curious by the state of my friend. He was unusually quiet, holding onto the bag in his hand tightly as the clacking of the horses' hooves and the chirping of evening crickets filled our ears. There was a field to our right, upon which a barn house stood. "Say, Pasha." I interrupted his atmosphere of thought. "Why did you ask for that man's shoes?" He didn't say a word. Instead, he opened the bag and procured one of the two shoes. Finally, he turned to me, to determine where Mr. Kilburn was when he was murdered. "Like I said, it can't be that far." He grabbed hold of the reins, then pulled the horse to a stop. He hopped off, carrying the bag and the shoe with him. Putting the shoe up to the light, he procured his magnifying lens from his breast pocket. Observing the sole of the shoe, a grin spread across his face. A grin almost the size of his curled moustache. Putting the lens back, he scratched the sole, extracting a small speck of something. It appeared like a hairball, or a small splash of dirt, except it was more plant-like. "What is that?" I asked curiously. "Moss," he replied. "Sphagnum moss." "We have a clue, Sykes. We have a big clue." He was excited. It was the first time I'd seen the Pasha being genuinely excited about a discovery. "Not that I have spent years with him to begin with." "Sykes," he exclaimed, "where can we find sphagnum moss here?" "Well, I don't know what a sphagnum moss is," I shamefully admitted, "but I know where to find moss in general. Usually in wet areas, like a bog." "Yes, a bog. There should be a bog somewhere near Cuddington. In that case, that is our destination after our sleep in the village. Let us proceed." The next morning, I arose from my bed to find Isa Pasha already dressed, seated at the breakfast table. The maid brought in coffee, which he happily and wholeheartedly drank while taking breaks using the methodology of medium sips, with a breath between each one. There were scrambled eggs with toast, hopelessly waiting for me on the glorious breakfast spread. I washed my face, got dressed, then joined the Pasha as he indulged in his own plate of eggs, along with a slice of raisin bread. He chewed slowly, me knowing that he wasn't a fast eater to begin with. Steam rose from his coffee cup as I yawned tightly, hurting my jaw. "Morning, Captain," he greeted. "Please eat, or else your eggs will go cold." I nodded at him gratefully, then began to feast upon my warm meal. The Pasha added 2 sugar cubes to his coffee, before stirring it with a spoon, making a sound as it ran against the round edge of the cup. "Today," he said after taking a sip, "we find the body of this Kilburn fellow." My eyes widened in surprise. "You know where it is?" The Pasha nodded. "The bogs, remember last night?" Yvette, I had discovered sphagnum moss on the bottom of his shoe. "A little, but enough for me to recognize." "What is sphagnum moss anyway?" I asked after a moment of silence. "Bog moss," he replied. "It grows in the bogs, acidifying the water around it. Because of this, the tiny living beings that decompose living tissue cannot exist. No. They cannot live and work, hence any living tissue thrown in can be preserved. So you're saying that if we find Terry in the bogs, we shall find him in such a state as if he had just been murdered?" The Pasha phased into a moment of thought, sipping his coffee as he gazed into his reflection in the kettle. "Maybe a little older. Yana, let us finish up our meal, then head down to the peat bogs." The peat bogs were no lovely sight to visit. It was a vast area of marshland with islands of growing plant mass. The mountains came into view as we left our hotel room, leaving Cuddington behind us. Isa Pasha bought a pair of waterproof boots, and a pair for myself as well in appreciation to his regular generosity towards others. He began to stroll into the obscure murky waters, bending to keep his hand low and his walking stick in front as a guide. "Now, my dear friend Sykes, we must figure out which part of this place the body has been disposed of." I could only imagine that Nigel committed the crime wearing little clothing to keep his legs dry. Isa went to one of the green islands, then dug his hand into the accumulated moss. He grinned pleasantly to himself, turning his face towards me. "If you were Nigel, where would you throw the body?" "Well," I said, lost in thought, "on the deeper side of the bog, so that no one would easily find it." I swatted a mosquito near my face, scowling at its horrific buzz. Isa looked at me with a rueful face. "You are close, my friend. Not a bad guess. That this Nigel man, he might have thought something more clever. Look," he pointed at the mass of moss. It floated upon the murky water, disturbed by Isa Pasha's movements as he made his way towards me. "If I were to hide a body here, Sykes," he continued, "I would keep it under the moss. It would conceal it almost perfectly." He looked around, his hand over his eyes, searching for something. Finally, his eyes shot up as he grabbed my sleeve. "Follow me," he said. I obeyed, following behind his trail. We passed through islands of moss as the water began to become deeper and deeper. The islands started to become bigger and bigger. Isa Pasha halted, then stabbed his stick through one of the masses, pushing it around. Then he retrieved it. "I am sorry, Sykes," said he. "It is not appropriate to search for a body in this manner. I don't know if you notice, but this mass was once part of a larger one. Look, its back edge is irregular, as if it was torn apart." He rushed towards the patch of water between it and another large mass of moss. Holding his cane in one hand, he placed it hard onto the ground, then dipped his other free hand into the island. He moved his arm about, feeling about if he could grab hold onto anything. He then heaved, moving backward, tugging at something from down below. Finally, I could make out what it was he was holding. A cold, pale hand. It was the hand of Terry Kilburn, Isa Pasha's hand clasping onto it. Not long after, his white, phantom-like face accentuated from the water. That was how Isa Pasha had solved the mystery of the missing body. We alerted a nearby constable, who sent a messenger boy to Inspector Basil. With the evidence before the jury, Nigel Bruce was hanged. News of the mystery was surely heard by the papers, as I saw my companion the next morning, smiling humbly at his accomplishment, with the tassel of his fez dangling by his side. "Alhamdulillah," he sighed. "Another mystery solved." "Indeed," I said as I put on my hat. "Indeed it is." He sat back, closed his eyes, then fell asleep soundly. It wouldn't bother him to move to the bed. Out of courtesy, I placed a blanket upon him as he rested, then removed a piece of moss that was inconspicuously hidden inside within his beard.